February 1979. Cold winter air hanging over Tyneside, and up the hill from the river, St James's Park was waiting for the biggest fixture of the season, Newcastle v Sunderland. This was the day Gary Rowell smashed in a hat-trick, and Sunderland ran out 4-1 winners on Newcastle's own turf. But long before Rowell was sticking the ball in the Lees' end net, the real war was kicking off down the hill, in and around the stretch of road that ran alongside the old city walls. Just a short walk from the station, the bus stands and the boozers where away fans always gravitated. To understand why it blew up there, you've got to remember what English football looked like in the 70s. You had massive, open terraces, minimal segregation, and street policing that swung wildly from half asleep to massively outnumbered. Whole city centres turned into battlegrounds at weekends, and derbies up here were about far more than 90 minutes. Newcastle at that time were on the slide, relegated, restless, expecting promotion, but getting mediocrity instead. Sunderland were on the way up again, their support buzzing after years of struggle and still dining out on the 73 Cup win. By early 1979, they'd got a bit of momentum, and crucially, a firm of lads who fancied themselves as more than just cannon fodder on Derby Day. The way it usually went in those days was simple. Newcastle owned the ground, owned the pubs around it, owned the routes in and out of the city centre. Sunderland always turned up in decent numbers, but more often than not, they were penned, escorted, and picked off in smaller groups. But the 24th of February 1979 was different. That morning, red and white poured into Newcastle in serious numbers, hundreds, by some accounts nudging towards the 1,000 mark. They came by train into Central, by bus into Worswick Street, by car up the A19, and instead of slipping quietly up the hill in tight little police escorts, plenty of them made a point of marching right through the city, down Westgate Road, up toward the Gallowgate, cutting across and around Bath Lane, that strip by the old city wall, a natural funnel between town and the ground. That's where it sparked. Newcastle's lads were already out in force. This was the era before named firms, but the same faces, estate mobs, terrace crews, the hard cases who'd claimed the Leeses and Gallowgate as theirs for years. The resentment from what would happen later on the pitch was already there in the build-up. Toon struggling, Sunderland resurgent, and thousands of Mackhams daring to act like they owned parts of Newcastle city centre. This is the story of the Battle of Bath Lane. The early trains into Newcastle were always the first litmus test. Some derbies, Sunderland would turn up in dribs and drabs, a couple of coaches, a few hundred hardy souls, tucked behind the police line and shunted up the hill before the locals even finished their pints. But not this time. Hundreds flooded out of Central Station, singing, surging, waving scarves, and moving with a confidence that immediately rattled the locals. The Evening Chronicle that weekend claimed 4,000 Sunderland fans had taken over parts of the city centre in the hours before kickoff. Whether that exact number is perfect or not, the scale was obvious. This wasn't a token away following, this was a statement. Instead of being shepherded straight up St James's Boulevard, many Sunderland fans roamed up Westgate Road, down toward Pink Lane, spilling into side streets, testing the police lines, and making their presence known well beyond the usual away fan routes. Pub after pub had their windows steamed up with black and white shirts pressed against the glass, watching their rivals roll past. The local lads weren't used to seeing Sunderland enter the city like that. Not in those numbers, and not with that swagger. Trouble was inevitable. Bath Lane sits in a strange pocket of Newcastle. Not quite city centre, not quite residential, but a natural bottleneck between Central Station and St James's Park. It's narrow, hemmed in by old stone walls and tight back lanes, and back in 1979 it had something else. A perfect blind corner. If two mobs found themselves there at the same time, there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. And that's exactly what happened. Sunderland fans pushed up from the station side. Newcastle fans came down from the Gallowgate and the pubs off Westgate Road. And for a few minutes, the only thing separating them was a thin line of officers who were already stretched to breaking point. Once the first few Newcastle lads surged forward, the police line collapsed instantly. Not through cowardice, just sheer weight of numbers. Sunderland fans came the other way. More poured in from the station side. Newcastle lads spilled down from Westgate Road. The whole thing folded into itself like two tides colliding. Bath Lane became a funnel of bodies. Punches, boots, lads tumbling into the stone walls, others spilling into the back lanes, some scrambling up the steep banks to get a swing in from higher ground. Reports later talked about men rolling down the hill fighting, which sounds like tabloid exaggeration, until you remember the geography. That slope made it a chaotic, shifting battlefield where footing was half the fight. The noise was unreal, not the chanting you get inside a stadium, but a roar of pure adrenaline, groups bursting forward, then getting pushed back, then surging again. Locals leaned out of pub doors watching like it was a movie. Cars reversed back up the street, police vans screeched into the area, sirens drowned out by the crowds, and still the fighting didn't stop. Bath Lane wasn't one quick skirmish, it was a rolling clash that moved up and down the street, splintering into side battles, reforming, breaking again whenever police managed to wedge themselves between the groups. Neither side truly won the fight, but both sides made sure it was remembered. A legendary toe-to-toe with neither side backing down, and the name the press printed the next day, the Battle of Bath Lane, stuck for life. When the worst of the fighting finally thinned out, you'd think the temperature might have dropped a notch. Not a chance. All that happened was the battleground shifted up the hill, because every single lad who wasn't in cuffs, covered in blood, or dragged into a waiting police van still had a match to get to. This wasn't the modern funeral march escort, where police horses outnumber fans and drones buzz overhead. This was thousands of rival supporters separated by about 6 feet of air and a thin line of exhausted coppers. Now, Sunderland have had plenty of heroes in derbies, but Gary Rowell in 1979 is the one name that still gets Toon fans wincing, like someone's shoved a cold needle into their ribs. Local lad, red and white to the core, and he walked into St. James's Park that day like he'd been born for it. His performance was ruthless. Newcastle weren't dreadful, just disjointed, tense, and rattled from everything happening off the pitch. Sunderland, by contrast, were sharp, organised, and feeding off the energy of their fans. By the time the fourth went in, the away end was absolute bedlam. Lads climbing barriers, scarves spinning, bodies flying everywhere, and the Newcastle boys had seen enough. Objects flew, coins, plastic bottles, small chunks of terrace gravel. Security did their best to shield the Sunderland corner, but they were fighting a losing battle. The anger in the home stands was like a storm cloud, heavy, black, crackling at the edges. Some Newcastle fans tried to climb toward the Sunderland end, only to be met by police truncheons and the first signs of real crowd control all afternoon. When the final whistle went, Sunderland 4, Newcastle 1, the police locked the gates to try to let the home fans disperse first. It didn't hold. The sheer mass of bodies behind the barriers eventually pushed them open, and suddenly, the entire area around St. James's Park turned into a swirling mass of movement. Supporters flooding out, looking for their mates, looking for a route home, and for some, looking for round 2. Sunderland fans surged toward the exits down toward Bath Lane and Westgate Road. Newcastle fans spilled out from the Gallowgate and the Leazes. Police tried to divert one mob toward the city centre, the other toward the outskirts, but the lines blurred instantly. Bottles smashed across pavements, groups clashed at junctions, in alleyways, outside corner shops. Dozens more arrests were made, dozens more injuries recorded, and as supporters finally made it back to trains, coaches and cars, the chaos continued. Emergency cords pulled on the football specials, carriages wrecked, police completely overwhelmed at Seaburn and beyond. It wasn't just a derby, it was the beginning. Firms were starting to form, not named yet, but the lads who'd later become the backbone of the notorious 80s mobs were very much in the thick of it that day. Both sides had groups who knew exactly what they were doing. Both sides had leaders, foot soldiers, and young'uns thrown into the mix. This wasn't the usual terror scrapping. This was organised, committed, territorial warfare. If you were there that day, make sure to give us your version of events in the comments. We'd all love to hear it. And remember to like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe if you're new, you know it makes sense. Thanks as always for watching, I'll see you next time.